We live in the most explained world in human history. Every action can be analyzed, every behavior reduced to data, every decision justified with numbers, charts, and models. We are told why we think the way we think, why markets rise and fall, why societies collapse, why people obey, why they rebel. There is always an explanation waiting, always a framework ready to absorb uncertainty and turn it into something manageable. And yet, despite all this clarity, confusion has never been higher. People argue endlessly while talking past one another. Entire societies fracture over rational disagreements. Intelligent individuals believe contradictory things with absolute confidence. We have more information than ever before, yet truth feels increasingly elusive. It is as if the more logically we explain the world, the less we actually understand it. This is where the seduction begins. Logic promises something deeply human: certainty. It offers an escape from chaos. It tells us that if we think carefully enough, clearly enough, rigorously enough, the mess of reality can be tamed. Logic does not merely explain, it reassures. It whispers that confusion is not permanent, that ambiguity is a temporary failure of analysis, that with the right system, the right language, the right structure, everything will finally make sense. And when a tool offers certainty, it rarely remains just a tool. Over time, logic stops serving thought and begins ruling it. It becomes the measure by which reality itself is judged. What fits the system is accepted. What resists it is dismissed. What cannot be clearly stated is treated as meaningless, irrational, or irrelevant. Slowly, quietly, logic transforms from a method of understanding into a filter that decides what is allowed to exist. This transformation did not happen by accident. At the dawn of the 20th century, the world stood intoxicated by reason. Science was conquering nature. Mathematics was achieving unprecedented precision. Machines were reshaping reality itself. For the first time in history, it seemed possible that human thought could be perfected. That confusion was not a permanent condition, but a technical problem waiting to be solved. Philosophy, long plagued by endless disputes and unresolved questions, looked on with envy. Why should physics progress while philosophy stagnated? Why should engineers build bridges that stand, while philosophers argued endlessly about meaning, truth, and reality? The answer, many believed, was simple. Philosophy lacked rigor. It lacked structure. It lacked logic. If philosophy could be rebuilt on the same foundations as mathematics, if thought itself could be formalized, purified, stripped of ambiguity, then confusion would disappear. Disagreement would dissolve. The ancient problems of existence would finally be resolved, not through wisdom or experience, but through clarity. It was in this intellectual climate that a quiet, intense, and deeply troubled man emerged at the center of the storm. Ludwig Wittgenstein did not see himself as a philosopher in the traditional sense. He saw philosophy as a disease, an illness caused by misuse of language. Human beings, he believed, were not confused because reality was mysterious, but because they spoke about it incorrectly. Words, improperly structured, generated illusions. Concepts, loosely defined, created false problems. If language could be cleaned, logic sharpened, and meaning fixed, philosophy itself could be ended. Not reformed. Ended. His early work would become one of the most influential and dangerous texts of modern thought. A book so precise, so austere, so confident, that it dared to claim it had drawn the limits of what can be meaningfully said. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus was not written as an invitation. It was written as a verdict. It proposed a radical idea, that reality itself has a logical structure, and that language, when properly constructed, mirrors that structure perfectly. The world is made of facts. Facts can be expressed as propositions. Propositions follow logical rules. And anything that cannot be expressed within the system, ethics, beauty, meaning, God, does not belong to the realm of knowledge at all. It does not mean those things are false. It means they are unspeakable. This was logic at its most seductive, elegant, brutal, clean, a vision of thought without ambiguity, without confusion, without emotional interference, a system that promised to separate sense from nonsense with mathematical precision. And for a generation exhausted by metaphysical confusion, it was intoxicating. The appeal of this vision is easy to understand. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. Uncertainty feels like weakness. To live without firm foundations is to feel exposed. Logic offers shelter. It replaces the anxiety of not knowing with the calm authority of structure. It tells us where thought must stop, where questions are illegitimate, where doubt is no longer allowed. But this is where the danger begins. When logic defines the limits of meaning, anything outside those limits becomes invisible. Human experiences that resist clean formulation, grief, love, guilt, faith, awe, are quietly pushed aside. Not denied outright, but treated as secondary, subjective, irrational, unfit for serious consideration. What begins as intellectual discipline slowly becomes intellectual arrogance. The elegance of logical systems disguises their violence. Every system simplifies. Every framework excludes. But logic, because of its precision, hides its exclusions behind necessity. It does not say, "I choose to ignore this." It says, "This cannot be meaningfully discussed." And in doing so, it transforms limitation into authority. Wittgenstein himself sensed this tension, though he did not yet fully understand it. His early philosophy was driven by an almost obsessive desire for purity. He believed that once the logical structure of language was revealed, all philosophical problems would vanish. Silence would replace confusion. Peace would follow clarity. But silence is not neutral. When logic tells us to remain silent about what matters most, it does not eliminate confusion. It suppresses it. And suppressed confusion does not disappear. It returns in distorted forms. Ideology, dogma, technocracy, systems that speak flawlessly while understanding nothing. This is why logical systems are so attractive to power. A perfectly structured argument can justify almost anything if its premises are left unquestioned. Bureaucracies thrive on logical consistency while ignoring human consequence. Political narratives become airtight while detaching entirely from lived reality. Propaganda rarely relies on obvious lies. It relies on internally coherent stories that exclude inconvenient truths. Logic, when elevated above life, becomes a tool not of understanding, but of control. And this is the unsettling realization buried within Wittgenstein's early vision. A world perfectly described by logic would not be a world fully understood. It would be a world flattened, reduced to what can be said, calculated, categorized, and managed. By the end of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein arrives at a chilling conclusion. After laying out the structure of meaningful language, after defining the boundaries of sense, he tells the reader that the most important things lie beyond those boundaries. They cannot be spoken. They can only be shown. And then he delivers the line that haunts modern thought: "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." This sentence has been interpreted as wisdom, as humility, as restraint, but it can also be read as a warning, because a culture that mistakes silence for resolution does not eliminate confusion. It simply hands meaning over to those who control the language. And once that happens, logic no longer liberates the mind. It disciplines it. The tragedy is that Wittgenstein believed he had solved philosophy. In reality, he had exposed something far more dangerous: the possibility that logic itself, when misunderstood, becomes a mirror that distorts reality rather than revealing it. And slowly, painfully, he would come to realize that the very system he built, so precise, so admired, so influential, had misunderstood the nature of meaning itself. That realization would shatter his certainty, and it would change everything that followed. Wittgenstein did not arrive at his philosophy through calm reflection. He arrived at it through inner warfare. His ideas were not born in lecture halls alone, but in trenches, isolation, and relentless self-confrontation. To understand his early obsession with logic, one must understand the psychological pressure that shaped it. He lived during a time when Europe was tearing itself apart. The First World War was not merely a political catastrophe. It was an existential one. Entire belief systems collapsed under the weight of mechanized slaughter. Progress, reason, and enlightenment, once symbols of hope, now powered destruction on an industrial scale. For many thinkers, this chaos demanded explanation. For Wittgenstein, it demanded elimination. He could not tolerate ambiguity. Not intellectually, not emotionally. Uncertainty felt like moral failure. Confusion felt like corruption. And so logic became more than a method. It became refuge, a fortress against the madness of the world and the instability within himself. The Tractatus was written under these conditions. Parts of it were drafted while he served as a soldier, surrounded by death and disorder. Yet the text itself is almost unervingly calm. Each proposition is numbered, precise, and stripped of excess. No rhetorical flourish. No speculation. Only structure. Only certainty. This was not accidental. The book reads like an attempt to impose order on existence itself. Every sentence feels designed to leave no room for interpretation, no space for doubt. Reality in this vision is clean. The world is made of facts. Facts are atomic. Language, when properly arranged, locks onto these facts with perfect precision. In such a system, misunderstanding is not tragic, it is mechanical. If confusion arises, it is because language has malfunctioned. Use the correct logical form, and the problem disappears. Philosophy, once a battlefield of competing worldviews, becomes a technical discipline. Not wisdom, but clarity. Not insight, but correctness. But there is a psychological cost to this purity. To preserve logical perfection, vast regions of human life must be excluded. Anything that resists formalization becomes suspect. Emotions cannot be proven. Values cannot be pictured. Ethics cannot be verified. And so they are quietly pushed beyond the boundary of what can be meaningfully discussed. This is where language begins to harden. Meaning is no longer something lived or felt. It is something permitted. If a statement cannot be mapped onto reality with logical exactness, it is not false, it is nonsensical. The world becomes divided not into true and false, but into speakable and unspeakable. And the unspeakable includes almost everything that makes life worth living. Love becomes a problem. Suffering becomes an inconvenience. Faith becomes an error. Beauty becomes a confusion. None of these fit cleanly into logical form, so they are placed outside the system. Not denied, but exiled. Wittgenstein believed this exile was necessary. He believed that by drawing a firm boundary around language, he was protecting thought from illusion. But in doing so, he was also shrinking the world. This psychological pattern is not unique to him. Human beings often respond to uncertainty by tightening control. When reality feels overwhelming, we build systems. When experience becomes unbearable, we reduce it. When meaning threatens to overflow, we constrain it. Logic, in this sense, becomes a coping mechanism, a way to survive chaos by refusing to acknowledge it. And the more chaotic the world becomes, the more appealing rigid systems grow. This is why logical absolutism has always been politically tempting. A system that claims total clarity leaves no room for dissent. A framework that defines meaning also defines deviance. Once language is fixed, disagreement becomes error, and error becomes threat. Wittgenstein did not intend this outcome, but intention does not negate consequence. The fortress of logic he built was elegant, yes, but it was also merciless. And merciless systems, once constructed, rarely remain neutral. As Wittgenstein's ideas spread, they were embraced with near-religious fervor. Here, finally, was a philosopher who did not argue endlessly, but declared an ending. A thinker who did not multiply problems, but eliminated them. For those exhausted by ambiguity, this was liberation. But liberation for some often means confinement for others. By defining the limits of meaningful language, Wittgenstein had also defined the limits of acceptable thought. Philosophy, once a space for wrestling with existence, now became a matter of linguistic hygiene. The task was no longer to understand life, but to clean up sentences about it. And something essential was lost in the process. When language becomes a cage, experience must contort itself to fit inside. What cannot be clearly articulated is treated as though it does not exist. This does not make life clearer, it makes it quieter. And silence, when enforced by structure, becomes a form of violence. Psychologically, this reflects a deeper struggle within Wittgenstein himself. He was not merely solving intellectual puzzles. He was attempting to escape himself. His writings reveal a man deeply uncomfortable with emotion, contradiction, and moral uncertainty. Logic offered him distance. It transformed inner turmoil into external structure. But the mind cannot be disciplined into peace. The more rigid the system became, the more pressure it generated. Cracks began to appear, not in the logic, but in its purpose. Wittgenstein slowly realized that his framework did not clarify life. It bypassed it. It did not explain meaning. It avoided it. Ethics, he had claimed, lay outside language. Yet ethics governed every human action. Meaning, he said, could not be spoken. Yet people lived and died by it. The very things declared unsayable were the things that mattered most. This contradiction became unbearable. The turning point was not sudden. It was slow, corrosive, and deeply personal. Wittgenstein withdrew. He abandoned academic philosophy. He gave away his wealth. He lived in isolation, worked as a schoolteacher, and wrestled silently with the implications of his own ideas. What haunted him was not that his logic was wrong, but that it was incomplete in a dangerous way. By trying to eliminate confusion, he had misunderstood its role. Confusion was not merely error. It was a sign that language had reached its limits, that meaning was not a structure to be perfected, but an activity to be lived. The cage he built was real, and he was inside it. This realization marks the end of Wittgenstein's early obsession. The belief that clarity could replace wisdom, that precision could substitute for understanding, that logic could save us from ourselves. It could not. And in recognizing this, Wittgenstein would begin a second intellectual journey, one far more unsettling than the first, a journey that would challenge not only philosophy, but the modern faith in rational systems themselves. Because if logic can mislead even the most disciplined mind, then the problem is not misuse. The problem is belief. Belief that structure equals truth. Belief that clarity equals meaning. Belief that what cannot be said does not matter. And that belief would soon collapse. Wittgenstein did not revise his philosophy the way most thinkers do. He did not refine it, defend it, or expand it. He abandoned it. The confidence that once fueled his work collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind something far more unsettling than error. Doubt about the very foundations of clarity itself. After publishing the Tractatus, he believed his task was complete. Philosophy, as he understood it, had reached its endpoint. The logical structure of language had been revealed. The problems were dissolved. Nothing more needed to be said. So he walked away. He left academia. He rejected intellectual authority. He lived in isolation, teaching children, designing buildings, performing manual labor. To many, this looked like withdrawal. In reality, it was confrontation. Away from theory, Wittgenstein faced the stubborn complexity of ordinary life, where meaning did not behave according to logical form. Everyday language refused to cooperate. People spoke imprecisely, metaphorically, emotionally. They contradicted themselves without confusion. They understood one another without definitions. Meaning flowed through tone, gesture, context, and shared practice. None of it resembled the clean logical propositions he once believed mirrored reality. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a crisis. If meaning worked in practice without logical precision, then logic could not be its foundation. If understanding preceded formal structure, then clarity was not the source of sense, but its byproduct. The very assumption that had driven his early work began to unravel. When Wittgenstein returned to philosophy years later, he did so as a different thinker. The ambition to build a perfect logical system was gone. In its place was a quieter, more radical insight. Meaning is not something hidden behind language, waiting to be discovered. It is something we do. Language, he realized, is not a mirror of reality. It is a tool embedded in life. Words do not carry meaning the way labels carry information. They acquire meaning through use, through repetition, habit, context, and shared human activity. To ask for the meaning of a word outside of how it is used is like asking for the purpose of a tool outside of the work it performs. This realization shattered the dream of perfect clarity. There is no single structure underlying all language, no universal logical form that guarantees understanding. Instead, there are countless overlapping practices, what Wittgenstein called language games. Each game follows its own rules, shaped not by logic alone, but by culture, power, and purpose. A word spoken in a courtroom does not function the same way in a poem. A promise does not operate like a description. A slogan does not behave like a question. Meaning shifts with context, and context cannot be formalized without losing what makes it meaningful. Logic, in this view, is no longer the master of language. It is one practice among many. This was not a rejection of reason. It was a rejection of its supremacy. Wittgenstein began to see that the search for absolute clarity had been misguided. Confusion was not always a problem to be eliminated. Often, it was a signal that language was being pushed beyond its natural habitat. Philosophy, then, was not a matter of solving problems, but of untangling misunderstandings caused by misplaced expectations. The collapse of certainty was not failure. It was awakening. This shift has implications far beyond philosophy. When meaning is understood as practice rather than structure, a disturbing truth emerges. Coherence is not the same as truth. A statement can be logically consistent and still profoundly misleading if it is detached from the life in which it operates. This is where Wittgenstein's insights become dangerous. In modern society, we are surrounded by language that feels convincing because it is internally coherent. Political slogans reduce complexity into neat binaries. Media narratives impose causal chains on chaotic events. Ideologies construct complete worldviews that explain everything, at the cost of understanding anything deeply. These narratives rarely collapse under logical scrutiny. That is precisely why they endure. They function as language games with their own rules, rewarding those who play along and marginalizing those who do not. Once you accept the premises, the conclusions feel inevitable. Dissent becomes irrational not because it is wrong, but because it violates the game. This is how logic misleads without lying. A statistical model can justify inhumane policies while remaining mathematically sound. A bureaucratic explanation can erase moral responsibility while preserving procedural correctness. A rational argument can normalize injustice by excluding lived experience from its scope. In each case, language does not reflect reality. It reshapes it. Wittgenstein's warning is subtle but devastating. The problem is not falsehood. The problem is misplaced certainty. When we confuse the smooth operation of language with access to truth, we become vulnerable to manipulation. We mistake fluency for insight, precision for wisdom. Online discourse reveals this daily. Arguments escalate endlessly, not because people lack logic, but because they are playing different language games without realizing it. Each side feels rational. Each side feels misunderstood. Each side believes clarity is on their side. But clarity without shared life is empty. This realization is destabilizing. It strips away the comfort of universal foundations. There is no final framework to guarantee meaning. No ultimate vocabulary to resolve disagreement. Understanding becomes fragile, provisional, dependent on human practices that can change, decay, or be corrupted. Yet this fragility is also a form of humility. Wittgenstein did not replace one system with another. He resisted system building altogether. His later work does not offer conclusions. It offers reminders. Do not be bewitched by language. Do not assume that because something is sayable, it is settled. Do not confuse explanation with understanding. The collapse of certainty does not leave us in darkness. It leaves us responsible. Responsible for how we use words. Responsible for the games we participate in. Responsible for recognizing when logic stops serving life and starts replacing it. Wittgenstein is not a destroyer of reason. He is a warning carved into modern thought. When logic forgets its limits, it does not liberate the mind. It imprisons it with elegance. And once certainty collapses, there is no return to innocence. Only the uneasy task of thinking without guarantees, of speaking without absolutes, of understanding that meaning is not found in structure alone, but in the messy, imperfect reality of human life. This realization prepares us for the final question. If logic can mislead without lying, if language can control without coercion, then what happens when these tools are deliberately used to shape belief? That is where the story leads next. The danger Wittgenstein uncovered did not remain in philosophy. It escaped into the world, quietly, systematically, and today, it shapes nearly every structure that governs modern life. We live inside logical systems so vast and normalized that we no longer recognize them as systems at all. They appear neutral, objective, necessary. Decisions are made based on the data. Policies are justified by the numbers. Outcomes are defended as rational conclusions. And because the language sounds reasonable, resistance feels irrational. This is how logic becomes power. Modern institutions rarely demand obedience through force alone. They persuade through explanation. They construct narratives so internally coherent that questioning them feels like ignorance. When a decision is presented as logical, disagreement is framed not as moral concern, but as emotional disturbance. Not thoughtful dissent, but cognitive failure. Statistics replace understanding. A chart can show economic growth while concealing human suffering. An algorithm can optimize efficiency while erasing dignity. A cost-benefit analysis can justify cruelty without ever mentioning the people it harms. Nothing here is technically false. And that is precisely the problem. Logic does not need to lie to deceive. By defining what counts as relevant, logical frameworks decide in advance what will matter. Variables are chosen. Context is trimmed. Experience is translated into numbers that can be processed, compared, and optimized. What cannot be measured is treated as noise. What cannot be quantified is dismissed as anecdotal. Over time, this reshapes reality itself. War becomes a strategic necessity. Surveillance becomes security. Inequality becomes an unfortunate but inevitable outcome of rational systems. Language smooths over moral friction until outrage feels unreasonable. The question is no longer whether something is right or wrong, but whether it is efficient. This is not accidental. Bureaucracy thrives on logical abstraction. The more distant a decision-maker is from lived consequences, the more rational the decision appears. Harm becomes procedural. Responsibility dissolves into process. Wittgenstein warned that meaning emerges from use, not structure. Modern power does the opposite. It replaces lived meaning with structural explanation. Once this happens, resistance becomes difficult, not because people are silenced, but because they are out-argued. Propaganda in the modern world does not shout. It explains. It builds complete models of reality in which every outcome feels inevitable. If you accept the premises, the conclusion follows logically. And if you reject a conclusion, you are told you do not understand the system. This is why contemporary manipulation is so effective. It does not demand belief. It demands acceptance of the framework. Media narratives operate the same way. Complex events are reduced to simple causal chains. Ambiguity is framed as confusion. Uncertainty is treated as weakness. A story that makes sense spreads faster than one that reflects reality honestly. Online discourse accelerates this dynamic. Platforms reward coherence, not truth. Arguments that fit neatly into ideological templates are amplified. Those that resist simplification disappear. Over time, entire populations become fluent in competing logical systems, each internally consistent, each emotionally convincing, and each incapable of communicating with the other. Everyone feels rational. No one feels understood. This is the modern trap. When logic becomes detached from life, it does not become neutral. It becomes instrumental. It serves whoever controls the framework. And the most effective frameworks are those that feel natural, those we stop noticing altogether. Consider how often disagreement is framed as irrationality. Not disagreement over values, but over facts. Once this shift occurs, persuasion turns into diagnosis. Opponents are no longer wrong. They are biased, uninformed, or mentally compromised. The language of reason becomes a language of exclusion. This is not the triumph of logic. It is its corruption. Wittgenstein's insight cuts directly through this illusion. Meaning cannot be fixed by definition alone. Understanding cannot be enforced by structure. Language works only within shared forms of life. When those forms fracture, clarity becomes performative rather than communicative. This is why so many debates feel endless. People are not failing to reason. They are operating within different language games, while assuming theirs is universal. Logic becomes a badge of identity rather than a tool of understanding. The result is a society saturated with explanations and starved of meaning. The solution is not to abandon logic. Wittgenstein never suggested that. The danger lies in mistaking logic for completeness, in believing that once something is logically justified, it no longer requires moral reflection, in assuming that clarity absolves responsibility. Intellectual responsibility begins with recognizing the limits of explanation. When a system claims to explain everything, ask what it excludes. When an argument feels airtight, ask what it leaves unsaid. When reasoning demands silence about lived experience, ask who benefits from that silence. These questions do not weaken thought. They protect it. Wittgenstein's legacy is not a theory, but a posture, a refusal to be bewitched by language, a suspicion toward systems that promise total clarity, a humility that recognizes that meaning is not something we discover once and for all, but something we negotiate continuously through human life. The most dangerous illusions are not emotional. They do not rely on passion or fear alone. They rely on order, on structure, on arguments that feel undeniable, perfectly logical illusions. To think responsibly in the modern world is not to reject reason, but to resist its absolutism. To remember that explanation is not understanding, that coherence is not truth, that language, when severed from life, becomes a substitute for reality rather than a guide to it. The final challenge is quiet, but demanding. Do not ask only whether something makes sense. Ask whether it makes contact with life. Because when language stops revealing reality and starts replacing it, logic does not liberate the mind. It teaches it how to obey.